In previous videos we have refloored, framed, jacked, jammed, lined, gap-filled and painted walls and ceilings, restored and hung old doors, and fitted the tricky angled scotia for our filled-in veranda remodeling project. In this video we'll be finishing the floors, then fitting and painting the skirting boards. The clean-up fairy once again has been in here, so we can get on and sand the floors and finish off the two rooms that we've created. We start by sanding the hoop pine tongue and groove floorboards using a large belt sander and 120 grit sandpaper. These floorboards are new, so all we're doing really is just cleaning off paint, dirt, fine scratches and any discoloration of the boards caused because they've been sitting out in the sun at some point. We sand in the direction of the grain of the boards. If you go across the grain, it makes it a lot more difficult to remove the sanding marks later on when we move to a finer sander. Sanding dust tends to build up quite quickly, so to see how we're going, we need to remove the dust with an industrial vacuum cleaner. The belt sander allows the bulk of the floor to be done quite quickly, but doesn't get right up to the edges. We do this using a disc sander, once again with 120 grit sandpaper. Although to sand right up to the end of the boards, we do need to go across the grain. But a disc sander, you can control the pressure a lot more easily and minimize the sanding marks. You do get a lot of dust in the air with a disc sander, so must wear a mask. The disc sander can also remove marks in the middle of the floor that are more difficult to do with the belt sander. It also does these parts quite quickly, but can't get right into those corners. To do this, we use a hand orbital sander, which is quite slow, but it's only a small amount, so it doesn't matter. We don't really need to get right hard up into the edge because the skirting board will be going on. We just need to sand up close enough so we'll be under that. The disc sander can reach right to the edge, which we've done where the floor meets the doorstep, and the small bits it can't get to can be done by hand or with a detail sander, which we have, but it's broken. We now need to do something where the new floor in the walk-in robe meets the old floor in the original bedroom. The plan is to cut a groove where the floorboards join and insert a piece of darker coloured timber in there. There was a wall here originally with a very wide skirting board, so the original bedroom floorboards stopped haphazardly under that skirting board. So we need to mark a line on the bedroom side that covers the ends of all those floorboards. This will be one side of our groove. The other side will be marked 50 millimeters from the first, as this is the width of the timber that we have. We then use our small saw set at a fixed depth to make a cut on each side of our groove. We do this by eye the best we can, which seems to be accurate enough for a floor. We then start cutting the groove out by hand with a wide chisel, which is a bit tedious, but what other option do we have? To make the cuts right to the very ends where the circular saw wouldn't reach, we use a multi-tool. The depth of this cut is judged by eye. It doesn't really matter if it's a little too deep. It's the depth of the chisel work that is important. I decided to take it around the corner there. I just think it would look a bit nicer than ending there, so I'm going to have to shape the piece of timber around the corner too. Then back to the tedious chisel work, which is now made more difficult by having to go around that corner. Right, I've trimmed these two pieces of wood that I have, cut a shape in there to fit around the corner. It's not long enough to go right across, so two pieces. And that one fits in the other corner. Cutting that piece of wood around the corner wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be, and once it's all finished off should make a very nice join between the two lots of floorboards. I've now cut those two pieces of wood to length, so they'll fit nice and tightly into the groove. We want them to be tight, which they are. They're fitting in the groove properly, but they're still sitting up a little high because my chisel work is a little uneven. The bottom of the groove needs to be quite even because these pieces of wood need to be glued in. If I try nailing them, they'll likely split because they're only thin and narrow. This means I need to do some more chiseling. Yippee! Still going by eye here, although I do fit the piece of wood in to see how well it fits. Once they're both fitting nicely, they can then be glued in place, with plenty of glue in the bottom of the groove, adjusting high spots with the chisel as I go, then plenty of glue on the bottom of each piece. We then need to put pressure on it while the glue dries. An old truck battery is ideal for one side, but what can we use for the other side? I have 20 kilogram bags of product I can use, but to get the weight of these bags to focus on our strip of timber, we need to use timber blocks. And to stop all this lot falling over, I can use a large paint can each side. The next day we can remove all this because the glue will be well dried. And rubbish gets toys. Looks pretty solid. The flooring for the original 130-year-old bedroom has a lot of nails in it which we need to punch down and fill in. I sanded back a small part of the original floorboards to see what they were like, and they are a slightly darker timber. I suspect it's red cedar, which was commonly used back in the 1800s. Then we can get on and sand our wooden strip and get it flush with the floor. No one wants to be tripping over this, do they? To get into the very edges, we use a multi-tool with a detail sander attachment. We use a very coarse attachment to begin with because we have 1.5 millimeters of hard wood to get down, and then use finer grits to get a nice finish. We then finish the wooden strip off using the disc sander to get it nice and flush with the floor and even the floor out where necessary. We'll fill in all those nail holes and restore the floor in the original bedroom in a future video. Then we continue on sanding the floor. We did have to go to 80 grit with the big belt sander in places where the floor wasn't so even, and then to a 120 grit, which is as fine as you can go with a belt sander, and then we had to go to 180 grit with the disc sander. This is as fine as we need to go because it gets all the scratch marks out and leaves a beautiful smooth finish. We've also got a new detail sander that will get into places that the other sanders won't. The dust from that disc sander just gets everywhere, so before we can oil the floor we need to give the floor a good vacuum and clean everything else in the room, including the doors and window sills and the walls, so none of the dust lands on the oil before it dries. Then we can get on and oil the floor. We're brushing on a blended tung oil, which we like to use because it has a very traditional look and really brings up the grain in the timber. The final finish is matte, it's not a high gloss. It can be made gloss if you use wax, but we're not bothering with that. It's something we can do later if we want. Once the floor is dry, we can then start the skirting boards. The rule of thumb here is to start with the longest length,
which happens to be in the walk-in robe around the 3.6 metre mark. The reason for this is to get the most out of the 5.4 metre lengths the skirting board comes in without having to join the longer lengths. The next longest length was 2.8 metres in the office, which we took out of a fresh length because we only had 1.8 metres left over from the last one, which is best used for a shorter length a bit later. The width of the office is about 1.9 metres, so this came out of the second full length, leaving us with about 600 millimetres that can be used on that end wall of the walk-in robe. We then used 800 millimetres from the 1.8 metres left over from the very first full length, which leaves us with another couple of half-metre lengths ideal for the ends of the walk-in robe. Although fitting this first piece did need a bit of fiddling about, chiseling away some excess filler just to get the end to fit in properly. And we needed to have several goes at cutting this to get the length right. The last remaining piece from our first two full lengths also required a couple of goes to get that length right. The next short pieces all came out of a third full length, leaving us plenty for another room. Once again, for a couple of these shorter lengths, we had to have a couple of goes to get the length right. That last tiny little piece was just cut out of a small bit of offcut, and that finishes the skirting board off. We're not putting any in that original part of wall, we'd rather just preserve that as it was. The painting fairy snuck in overnight and primed all the bare timber, and we're now filling in all the brad holes. And once dry, we use a chisel to remove all the excess filler. We've used dark brown filler in the corners, so it's easier to cover with dark brown paint. We then have a quick clean up with the industrial vacuum and get on and paint those skirting boards, which is quite a fiddly job. We're using a high gloss oil based enamel paint, which tends to run really easily, so it's difficult keeping it off those floorboards. We also only want to do this once, so need to cover a white undercoat with a dark colour in one coat, which is quite a challenge, particularly as every edge needs to be cut in. That is, we don't want any of the dark brown paint on the yellow walls or the oiled floor. We are using a special cutting brush designed for skirting boards, but even so, just getting that right quantity of paint and getting it smoothed out nicely without it running is quite difficult. Although where the paint does run onto the floor a bit, we use a rag soaked in terps wrapped around the putty knife to clean it off. This is another reason why we oil the floor first, so any paint that gets on it can easily be cleaned off. We're also touching up the door jambs as we go. To complete the skirtings for both rooms took a couple of hours, although it seemed a lot longer than that. The end result really does finish these two rooms off, and is much nicer than the way it was when we first got the place. Well, that's the end of this video. In the next video, we'll be finishing off the electrical.